Good morning, everybody, or whenever it is that you happen to watch this. I'm still at work, but things have slowed down just enough that I'm able to make a few videos. I'd like to make a couple. Now, I won't be able to upload them at this point, but whenever I will, they'll be ready. And as I mentioned in my previous update video, there's a lot of things that I'd like to talk about. Um, and I've decided the first thing I want to talk about, there's going to be a series of roughly related videos. Um, and I want to talk about them kind of in chronological order of building an argument. Um, not a not nothing profound or anything just like that. I just think that there's sort of a natural sequence here that I want to cover. And on this one, I want to talk about the origins of the state. Um, I've done this before, and I think that it's an interesting topic that needs to be kind of covered again. Um, there's limits to how definitive we can be when we discuss this topic because the archaeological evidence is pretty scanty, and also what we do have is it's not super clear. So we can't make really strong statements necessarily, but it is pretty interesting. Now this is prompted by a book that I read. Um, this was now a few months ago. The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt by Toby Wilkinson. This is the book. And this is not a book that I ordered on Amazon. This is not a book that was referenced to me that I wanted to go read, which is the case with most of my reading. Most of my reading is basically nowadays citations from previous books or stuff that I've heard referenced. In fact, just the other day I heard Tom Woods interviewed Michael Huemer, and he referenced what was it? Some British economist who did a lot of work on third world economies. I forget his name. But I went on Amazon and bought two of his books. And often when I'm reading a book, they'll reference other books, and I'll buy them. This is not the case. Back in March, when I was working, um, I underestimated how long I would be in the field, and I finished all the books that I had with me. And this prompted me to go to the local mall and just spend about $200 and I think about 20 books. And these are books that I would probably normally not have selected to purchase. These are books that they were the best that were available in the circumstances. A brick and mortar store, with rare exceptions, are not going to have the type of selection that is really going to draw my interest. I'm usually looking for very particular titles or very particular subjects, and oftentimes these are ones that aren't tread on by popular publishers that often, aren't going to be in a big store. Not always, but often. But I wanted to read, so I went through, and this is a popular book. It's got many reviews from, named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post. It's got the Wall Street Journal, New York Times endorsements, or at least writers from there, Los Angeles Times. So this is a popular book, and ancient Egypt is a topic that I have not done a great deal of reading about because it's one of the segments of history that actually gets covered a lot. If you watch the History Channel, there'll be more shows on ancient Egypt than any number of other, important historical civilizations. Although, to be fair, they tend to focus on a couple pretty narrow fields of study within Egyptology. This is kind of similar to World War II. There's quite a bit about World War II, but a disproportionately large amount of it's going to be about things like D-Day or FDR or Pearl Harbor, and you're going to have a lot less about things like, say, the Eastern Front or things that are actually at least as, if not more, important, but they don't hold the popular imagination as well, and so they don't get retread over and over and over and over and over and over again. With ancient Egypt, obviously, the outstanding kind of topic is the pyramids. The pyramids are just, people are infatuated with them, and they are extremely interesting, both in just how they're designed and how they function, but what they imply about the society that created them, I think, is probably even more pertinent, which is something that actually is not really delved into in the necessary depth, I think, most of the time. But lots of shows about that. And of course, a lot of ridiculous shows about whether aliens did it or not. There'll be stuff about King Tut's tomb, and then maybe stuff about Cleopatra or the lighthouse of Alexandria. But there's not too many that actually go in a very systematic relatively thorough way about the history of ancient Egypt. One exception I'll put out there, and I'll try and put a link if I can remember to do so, is a documentary called Egypt Uncovered. But it's about 4 hours long. You can watch it in its entirety on YouTube. And it begins with a site called Naphtha, which is a dried up lake bed in the western desert, in the desert west of the Nile, in far southern Egypt. I think it's fairly close to Sudan. And I think they're talking maybe like 5,000 BC, something like that. A time period when the savannah was much more, or when the Sahara was much more of a savanna, and not as arid as it is today. And you had herds of animals and seasonal lakes and rivers, apparently several large ones, and you had a community living around here. And this is some of the earliest megalithic architecture we find in Egypt is to be found there. And, it starts there and it goes. I believe that documentary goes. At least I know it goes to the New Kingdom. I don't know if it goes all the way to the Ptolemies or not. So this book goes from before Naphtha, a little bit anyway, all the way up to Antony and Cleopatra, which I think is maybe a bit far. Egypt started being ruled by foreign powers in late antiquity, or not late antiquity, in the late before Common Era period. After the New Kingdom, you had a period that was the transition to where they were basically being ruled by first Libyans, and then Kushites, and then Libyans and Kushites. And you had a couple kingdoms, and then you had a partial conquest by the Assyrians, then a total conquest by the Persians, and then the Greeks. And it's kind of a joke that there hadn't been an Egyptian ruler of Egypt from the time of let's say it depends if we count the Libyans or not, but from Ramses the IX all the way until Nasser in the 50s. It may be a little bit hyperbole there, but just to give you some idea. But what's interesting, the documentary says it well. It says it's the most enduring civilization, which is to say that its history is very, very long. We're talking about. It's funny too. They say that Herodotus, in his histories, names the first pharaoh of Egypt. He uses the term, I believe it was Menes, and we still think that is the first pharaoh of Egypt, although we don't call him Menes any longer. We call him Narmer. And there's lots of shows. There's a very famous artifact called the Narmer Palette, which was basically, I guess, a bowl for perfume, which I didn't know until reading this book, that depicts this person, Narmer. And that's actually pretty interesting to think that Herodotus has the same conclusion that we have today, even though he was writing 2,400 years ago. It's also interesting in terms of the scope. People like Caesar and Cleopatra are closer in time to us than they are to the pyramids. And the pyramids are not the beginning of Egyptian history. They're in the New Kingdom, but they're not the beginning by any means. They're several hundred years into actual Egyptian history. So this book covers a huge period, into the, I don't want to say the Neolithic, but prehistoric times, on up until the Ptolemy period, until Cleopatra and Antony, which is, a huge span of time. The historic part of that, it covers 3,500 years, and, it's not that thick of a book, although in its defense, we don't know a ton about huge sections of that period. So I would recommend this book as an overview. It will give you a little bit of information about the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom, the pre-dynastic period, what happened after the post-kingdom. The number of pharaohs' names who get thrown at you is kind of intimidating. Some of these names are really quite common and famous, although where we place them. You know, I'd heard names like Seti and Tutmosa and Amosa and Hatshepsut and Senusret and, you know, Khufu and Narmer and all these. Obviously, I'd heard all these names many times. Pepi, Horus Okan. Like, I've heard all these names before. Where they fit chronologically with each other and in relation to each other, yeah, couldn't tell you. Now, having read this book, I have a much better idea. I've said this, though, about a lot of ancient history is very pronoun heavy, and you have a lot of names of basically ethnic groups and or nations or states or tribes, and a lot of personal pronouns, and it's quite a lot. I'm thinking if you ever read the history of the Persian Empire, it's just the first couple chapters of that. It's so hard to keep track of what's going on because there's just so many groups, and we don't know much about these groups, and we're talking about a geographic region that we don't. It doesn't stand out. You know, like, oh, there's, you know, Eurasia's kind of doesn't have a lot of boundaries in it that make it real clear. Like, oh, okay, it's not like, say, Cyprus or Sicily where you go, okay, what's the chronology of the leaders who live in England, let's say. You know, when you're talking about Eurasia, you know, the Middle East, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of migration. You have different type names and different cultures, and it's pronoun overload. And Egypt is similar to that, in that, like, there's so many that it's a bit intimidating. But anyway, I definitely like the book. But I was pleasantly surprised because as soon as he started getting into kind of the dynastic period, he clearly had skepticism about the the moral implications about the society that he's studying. He actually chided historians for being essentially cheerleaders for Pharaoh, and this became most explicit, and I think rightly so, when he discussed the pyramids, because basically he says, and this is really the only kind of valid interpretation you can get, these monuments and the pyramids are just the most famous of a long history of monumental architecture, are created for the vanity and the aggrandizement, the personal aggrandizement of a tiny, tiny political elite, and that these structures, and again, the pyramids are only emblematic of a more general phenomenon, came at the expense of the well-being and indeed the lives of many, many Egyptians. Probably all Egyptians were made poorer in order to pay for these. I mean, not probably, definitely. And many thousands probably would have died. Now, at one point he talks about what were the mortality rates and the work crews designed to build these structures. And they said, we don't really know because, quite frankly, the chroniclers, the hierarchy in ancient Egypt really didn't give a shit. Nothing that they wrote indicates that they cared at all about the welfare of those burdened with aggrandizing them. I mean, if they did, maybe they did secretly or whatever. They didn't record that, or if they did, we haven't found those records. And we found quite a few records because they committed a great deal to stone. But they did find some references that the mortality rate in, like, say, an annual season could have been easily 10%. They found references to that actually being the case, and the way that it was referenced was in a very nonchalant way. So it wasn't like, oh my God, 10% of the workers died. This was an unusually bad year. It was, just, oh, whatever. And so that's not really an estimate, but that's just gives you some indication. I mean, looking at something like the pyramids, those would have taken decades to build, especially the Great Pyramids. And basically, you would be talking about a Corvi label. This is interesting. In the 19th century, when Egyptology got popular, the pyramids in ancient Egyptian society got a reputation for being a slave. The whole Ozymandias kind of notion of absolute despotic tyranny, blah blah blah, slaves, oppression, and then in the 20th century, this kind of changed to, like, oh no, these are nationalist monuments. This is good. I mean, look at all the tourists who come and look at them, and I even remember seeing a show where Egyptologists said, no, these weren't slaves. These were just people who were performing compulsory labor for the state. I'm like, how is that qualitatively different than slavery? Um, and and it's one thing to be a slave, maybe producing food or something. It's another thing to be a slave to be producing a tomb, a totally over the top, giant pile of rocks, impressive as that pile may be. Um, and actually, his skepticism about, he says basically many historians have just become cheerleaders. They spend all their time reading from Pharaoh's perspective, and they simply adopt Pharaoh's perspective and accept it uncritically, and accept the things that he claims uncritically. Um, and they like the pyramids, and they like Egyptology, and they like the monuments, and it's obviously very useful from a historian's perspective, but as a result, they tend to basically forget the fact that this stuff that came at the expense of the lives of in the case of ancient Egypt, literally a couple million people. Um, one shudders to think, if all that productive labor had been gone to what the people actually thought would be better for them, what the result would be. Anyway, that was kind of a welcome surprise. I don't think that this guy's a libertarian or anything like that, but that was kind of a welcome thing. But what I want to talk about, though, is 16 minutes into the video, is it's kind of how the Egyptian state started. And like I said, we don't know for sure, but we have clues. One thing I didn't realize before reading this book is that this people who lived in Nakfa in this now dried up lake bed in the western desert were pastoralists. Apparently, Nakfa is full of cow bones, and there were these nomadic pastoralists. Now, this is in the days before domestication of horses, so these people would not have been riding horses. They would not be like the Mongols or the Sioux Indians or anything like that. They would have been pedestrian pastoralists. A phenomenon which is historically in the past, in like Eurasia and Europe, we know that there were pedestrian pastoralists after the advent of the horse and later of the camel. Such pastoralism kind of died out in Eurasia. It persisted in Africa up until much later. And one example that I know of this would be the Tutsis and the Hutu. Basically, well, I'll get to that in a second. It's a historical phenomenon that pastoralists will often raid and attack more sedentary societies. And that from time to time, these pastoralists will assert themselves and actually become a ruling class, essentially a government over agrarian, more settled societies. And this phenomenon is so recurrent in history that actually there's not a few people who believe that that's where the state comes from. I think Franz Oppenheimer says this in his book, The State, and this is actually one of the main competing theories. Now, my understanding is this is not as favored today as it was in the past. That there might be a domestic genesis of the state, and I've made videos to that effect myself. But it is definitely the case that many, many states are established in this way, and we can go on. The Aztec state was. The Native American society, you had like the Apache and the Comanche establishing kind of, almost like a taxing right over more sedentary people like the Pueblo or the Navajo. In Africa, you had the Hutus who were agrarians, and then you had the Tutsis who were pastoralists and who were pedestrian pastoralists who basically became a ruling class over them. In China, you have this up until actually fairly recently with the Manchus. Now, the Manchus, debatable how nomadic they were by the time they conquered China, but they were very close to that anyway. They conquered China in 1644. Before them, Kublai Khan, the Mongol, had done the same in the 1200s. And in the Middle East, we have many of the monarchies in Mesopotamia trace their origins to this. You've got the Kassites, people like Hammurabi, his dynasty, not him personally, but his dynasty was established in that way. Um, and even the Persians were pastoralists initially, and this is just something that happens over and over and over and over again. And now I didn't realize, but it seems to me that this is very likely kind of the genesis of the Egyptian state. Or if that's not the case, the Egyptian state took on the form of the pastoralists, and I'll explain that in a minute here. Azar Gott, in his book, talks quite a bit about this, actually. I think there's an entire chapter about it. Basically, there are physical, practical reasons why a pastoralist would have an advantage over an agriculturalist. They don't have landed property, they're more mobile, even if they're on foot. There are elements about their lifestyle that are going to probably give them martial skill relative to a sedentary population. Their diets, I think the paleo enthusiasts out there would probably not fail to notice that a pastoralist is probably going to be eating a great deal more meat and wild fare, wild fruits and vegetables. A lot of what they probably wouldn't like is a lot of pastoralists would probably also eat a lot of dairy, depending on what population we're talking about. And whereas agriculturalists are eating mostly grains, carbohydrates, some of them probably not healthier. That's of course a more general thing. Earlier agricultural societies, up until basically the Industrial Revolution, had absolutely terrible health statistics compared to today, obviously, but also compared to the Mesolithic and Neolithic hunters that they supplanted. The people who spent their lives irrigating and planting crops, whether it be grains or rice or whatever, actually did live lives that were nasty, brutish, and short. Hard labor for long hours with poor quality diet does not a healthy body make. And then you have, even if it's a relatively small, a group of people who are basically walking and running all day, eating meat outside, fairly mobile. I mean, not only are they physically going to be stronger and more agile, if they're hunting all the time, if they're managing livestock, they're going to have martial ability with projectile weapons, with handheld weapons, and they're just probably going to have a very different outlook, much more, I'd say, broader horizons, like literally. I mean, if you spend all your day like going like this in a rice paddy or an irrigation field, you have a certain myopia, and that's not to say that a pastoralist is like super broad, but like you have to. This seems to have happened many times. It's very difficult to defend yourself because you don't know when you're going to get attacked. So there's a tactical disadvantage, and there's just a man-for-man difference in the martial ability, which means that a small group of pastoralists can run circles around even a large group of agriculturalists. This history is so full of examples of this that it bears repeating. What I didn't realize is, of course, when the Sahara was a savanna, there were apparently at least some populations of pastoralists in there, and many people have associated the rise of Egyptian civilization, if not specifically Pharaonic civilization, with the aridification of the Sahara and the movement of populations who lived in the desert into the Nile River Valley, one of the very few areas that was going to retain water, other than some of the oases. Obviously, people lived in the Nile Valley before that, and it seems likely that agriculture was already developing, although I have two other books about ancient Egypt I like to read. They go back farther, and maybe they'll address this, but typically you have agricultural, actually sedentism starts first, then agriculture, which is actually, most people think that it's agriculture that starts and produces sedentism. It's usually the reverse, actually. And then later you get archaeological evidence of states. You don't really have that prior to this, though. But one thing that I didn't realize until reading this book, that the iconography of the pharaohs incorporated many pastoralist bovine symbols. In fact, the pharaoh is often represented, say, as a bull. A very famous example of this that most of you are probably going to remember is the sarcophagus of King Tut. Now, this is, of course, thousands of years after this event would have occurred. But for those of you who remember it, I always remember noticing his hands are crossed and he's holding two objects. And one of them I kind of recognize based on my limited exposure to the Bible as a shepherd's crook, which is what it is. The other, I was like, what is that? It was a little thing, and it had like three little things hanging down. Like, that's a flail. That's a shepherd's flail. The pharaoh is depicted, and of course, King Tut's sarcophagus was not, an atypical example of artistic novelty. Egyptian art, and especially Egyptian royal art, is highly, highly, highly conservative, and we get very, very, very almost identical kind of reiterations of similar themes. And this crook flail theme is extremely popular, and these are both allusions to a pastoralist past. So what I'm saying is, like, I'm not necessarily saying the pharaohs of Egypt are literally necessarily descended from pastoralists, although I think likely at least some of them were, and genetically it would be relevant after many years of inbreeding. But like, they're at the very least adopting that iconography. But what also struck me about this book, and in a way that I didn't know and I wasn't prepared for, was the Egyptian monarchs had an explicit ideology of authoritarian domination and humiliation, not just of their enemies, which I kind of knew. There's a very common trope of an Egyptian monarch holding like three captives by the hair and smiting them with a mace. There's a strong association of the mace with the regal power, and usually these enemies will be, you'll have a Nubian, an Asiatic, and maybe a Libyan, and it's really kind of weird because the Egyptian rock art really kind of disturbs me because it's always in profile and they always have the same expression. So you could have a mother with a baby and she has the same expression as like the king bashing in someone's head, or I mean, it's very actually kind of disturbing to me at this point. It's funny that the statuary, they learned how to show a face in front. I mean, they could do a fairly good. It wasn't realistic. We don't get realistic sculpture until the Romans, and I mean, Greek sculpture is close to realistic, but they actually had idealized elements to the Egyptian sculpture. It's recognizably human, that's for sure. But like on the rock, it's always in profile. And yeah, again, whatever they're doing, they have the same look. They never smile, they never frown. They're just always looking the same way. But there was some statuary here. He had a picture of it. I should probably flip through and find it. But like the pharaoh's statue would be standing there, and on the ground that he would be standing on would not just be his foreign enemies, which I kind of already knew. I knew that that was a common. I smite foreigners, but his own people. Like, he explicitly tramples on his own people. And that wasn't just one, it wasn't like one particular, bad pharaoh. That was all of them. Like the throne room, the floor would be decorated in a motif of the Egyptian people for him to tread upon. I was not aware that it was like that explicit. But apparently it was, and this was. One has a hard time like saying this is how they depicted themselves, this is how they saw themselves, and then people are going to argue, and this is interesting. So people are going to argue, well, states came about. This is kind of there's a couple ways you can interpret the rise of states, and the popular one, the pro-government one, is that in these new settled societies, it was necessary to have a coercive central institution like a state in order to solve problems that can't be solved any other way. To solve the free rider problem, to limit negative externalities. Maybe there are particular institutional or infrastructural like projects that require this, like canals or some type of irrigation, or roads would be one, although there wasn't a lot of road building really back then. Um, and this is why states arose, to meet this this man. There was a demand. We needed an organization to organize society. We had these new problems had arisen because of civilization and sedentism and agriculture that didn't exist in hunter-gatherer, pastoralist, nomadic um, populations. And so the state is an institution that exists to fill that gap. Um, the pharaohs never couched their rule in those terms. Now, there was a philosophical concept that there's chaos in the world, and they need to have like an order, and they call it Mot. There needs to be Mot, and that the pharaoh had a role in that, basically as a deity. And there was a progressive deification of the pharaohs from a servant of heaven, or maybe an adopted son of a god, to a god, which god kind of shifted over time. I'm not going to get into the religion all here, that's a whole other thing. But eventually they started saying that they were gods. By the time you get to Akhenaten, and his father Amun-Re, whatever. So, it's very hard to look at something like the pyramids or the statuary where the pharaoh is depicted trampling on his people and say, oh yeah, the reason this institution arose was for the betterment of society. From the perspective of the pharaoh, the reason this institution exists is so he can have the maximum number of children, the most power, the most wealth, the most conspicuous status of anyone in society. And when we have their writings later in, say, the New Kingdom, when we had a kind of international system of great empires, especially the Egyptian, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Mitanni, the Assyrians, a couple more minor Syrian and Levantine palace states, or maybe even the Minoans or the Mycenaeans, the Akiawans, when they write to each other, it's not like, oh, I'm helping my people, and we need to build a canal to drain the sewer, to decrease the most good for the most people. They talk about, I need a palace to just show how rich I am, and you need to give me gold because you have a lot of it, and you need to I'm a great king because I won this battle, and I'm a great king because I defeated this enemy, and I'm a great king because blah 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 blah. It's all about their status and their power and their wealth, and doing better than the Joneses, basically. And I think that now that it's quite obvious that it's possible to do things like this. The infrastructure people talk about does not require a state to create, because we have examples of it not being created by states. The state's own kind of emphasis doesn't even seem to be on these tasks. And when they are, it's very hard to say how this is not self-serving when they do it. They do what's necessary to keep the population in line, but no more. But another, I think, better explanation is because if states really are better solutions to problems like this, if they're better at managing the resources in a sedentary society, why wouldn't they be better in an agricultural? If they are in a nomadic society, if they're so good at dispute resolution, if they can minimize intra-societal conflict, if they can solve problems, if they can increase productivity, why wouldn't that also be true in just about every other type of society, whether it's agrarian or not? I look at it like the desire, the will to dominate others is just present in society. It's either present in everybody to some degree, or it's present in certain individuals. It's debate. It's also kind of irrelevant. It's there in society, and there's a desire to manifest status and power and authority over others, and not to mention to accumulate resources. That's obviously true as well, and to accumulate women, to be perfectly blunt. And the pharaohs, as all monarchs, basically, their actions reveal this is a primary motivation. If they want to pretend, if they hire an apologist to make up an excuse as to why this is okay, and have someone say, "Oh no, Versailles isn't about the splendor of the monarch. That's for the glory of France." Well, okay, whatever. You keep telling yourself that. You know, the pyramid, you know, that's for Greater Egypt. You know, that's for, if that's not there, there won't, you know, there'll be chaos. We don't like, and like, you know, they even the Great Pyramid's the largest, but his son or his grandson built another one. He didn't make it quite as tall, but he built it on a slightly higher piece of land, so the top is actually a little bit higher. I'm like, yeah, he did that because he really wanted, because he knew that would be the best thing for the Egyptian people. Like, or he did that because he was trying to one up his, you know, Uncle Khufu, whoever it was. That was probably Sneferu, but I might be remembering that wrong. Um, yeah, like their actions clearly indicate that that's what they're really going for, and all this, well, it has ancillary benefit. Like that to me strikes me as just you know, rationalization. Um, but one thing that I thought while reading this book is that he points out, and again, I don't think this guy's a libertarian. That he's not coming from this from the point of view of trying to disprove states or show problems with states or anything like that. But he just says, look, we started to get in pre-dynastic periods, basically petty kings or proto-kings. Um, and this is a process that it's not well attested anywhere because it happens so early, but we have evidence that something like this happens in most places, where you get local strongmen who basically start as some kind of martial capacity probably, and they basically gain power over some population. You know, they are able to extort wealth, you know, later to be known as taxes, and they compete with each other, and eventually you end up with, you know, a smaller and smaller number of these. Now, geography is really, really important here. Certain geographical scenarios lend themselves much more readily to political domination from the center. So the Nile is perfect for this because you have, you know, basically inhospitable desert on either side. The actual Nile Valley itself is only a few kilometers wide in most places. There's no agricultural land that's more than a relatively short walk from the Nile, and the Nile provides a very, very convenient artery of transport. So, you know, it's not like a pastoralist who can run away, or an agricultural area that's, you know, basically two-dimensional and goes in all directions for a long way, and you know, it's very, very concentrated, and so it's very hard to like escape. There's very little, and the investment and time that you have to put in to rule by force is much less. If everybody that you want to expropriate is within a 1 hour walking distance, versus everyone who you would want to expropriate being in a 4-day walking distance or a 20-day walking distance, which is what you could literally have if you have an area where there's dry agriculture, where you don't need irrigation, where it rains enough everywhere that it's possible to grow basically more or less everywhere. The amount of effort you have to put forth to actually receive, you know, your plunder is much more. You know, and there's a cost. I don't want to say there's a curve, but like the more expensive it is to obtain this plunder, you know, the less likely it's going to happen. And if you have a society where everything is stuck in one spot, well, there you go. I mean, it's much easier, and we see this. The first states are concentrated in these major river systems in arid areas, especially in Mesopotamia, and the Tigris and the Euphrates, and in the Nile in Egypt. And then to a lesser extent, you get the same thing in China with the Yellow River, the Hui River, the Yangtze River. You know, where there's this, or actually from Mesoamerica also, you get it like around the lakes in central Mexico, you know, not in the arid regions. And what I think this shows is that, you know, the correlation for where the states arise first isn't really explained by, well, where's where does the institution of states solve, these free rider problems? And these arguments actually most people don't even use, but these more sophisticated arguments as to why states are justified or warranted or a good idea. It's what areas are most susceptible to this type of coercion. That's where they arise. A chieftain in a nomadic society, he has the same kind of desires probably as the pharaoh would. He would just love it if he had a temple to himself, and he would just love it if everybody was giving him 50% of what they produce, and he would just love it if he could have a harem of 100 women or whatever. The problem is it's very difficult for him to achieve that in a nomadic or semi-nomadic society, because people who don't, because while that's in his interests, it's in nobody else's, right? And so his would-be people that he would like to exploit, they have every reason to try and thwart his exploitation of them. And if you're a nomad, like, that's actually fairly easy. You just leave. Sorry, there's a truck unloading something right now. Happens a lot on an oil field. Like, it's not. I'm not gonna say it's easy, but it's relatively easy. It's much easier than if you're settled in a farmhouse, or and you have a field that you have to. You can't really leave, And so, sure, a nomadic chieftain can do bad things and can be brutal, but he has to work much harder for a unit of plunder. There may not be as much plunder to go by, and the means for resistance it's much more practical, which means it's much more likely to happen. So, while you might have a very, very martially capable, maybe, or even politically, persuasive chieftain, it's very unlikely that that scenario is going to get institutionalized, because all the variables, it's just much more difficult. There's less to take. It's harder to get. It requires more effort. So it's not going to happen as much in a society where less effort gets you more. It doesn't take as much effort to dominate the Nile River Valley as it, say, would a huge agricultural area. And that expands not just in one narrow band, but in all four directions for however far. And while you're in one spot, like expropriating one of them, what are all the other people doing? Maybe they're organizing against you. Maybe they're fleeing or whatever. Whereas if there is no other place, when you're in the Nile River, like, you can dominate each little section. And that's what happened. You had basically all these little petty states. Eventually, one of them, beat out all the other ones, and Narmer is probably, the guy who did that, or relatively near to when that happened. And from that on, like, that geographical region, it really lends itself to being dominated by one person, one group, or one institution. In other areas that don't have such a very clear demarcation of such a natural border, you actually have much more ebb and flow, because there's different. It's much less bounded, and so the states are much more fluid and much less concrete than they say are in Egypt. In Egypt, it was very, 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 and so I think that the answer to why, like, the Egyptian state was so enduring, and also why it had such enormous power within its society, is that the geography made the terrain, the circumstances of that society made it particularly susceptible to central control by a single institution. It wasn't that Egyptians needed a state more, or that the Egyptian scenario required state. I mean, people are going to talk about, well, the Nile flooded. These are things that people can understand and do understand, even if the state doesn't tell them. People can irrigate without states. People can plant agriculture without states. And, the agriculture, all that stuff had started in Egypt prior to states. Like, it wasn't like there was nothing and a king appeared and then civilization sprung forth. Like, the civilization predates. The urbanism predates. Although, I don't know how much you could say Egypt was really that urban. The big urban centers are more associated with, say, Mesopotamia than they are with the Nile River Valley. Be that as it may, it's more a question of, this is where it's physically possible. And, this is still true today. Nobody really wants to pay taxes that much. even the people who justify it. But they realize that the price of not doing it, the, the, the costs that you have to incur to try and resist are higher, and so the people, just say, okay, I'm going to put up with it. But if the scenario is different, and this could be because of territorial reasons or geographic reasons, for instance, let's just say hypothetically, let's say people got in a spaceship and they went and they founded a colony on Mars, and let's say that they were able to basically sustain themselves on Mars. It's very unlikely that they would be willing to send tax money to Uncle Sam. Like they could potentially, this is assuming that Uncle Sam didn't have the ability to say vaporize the entire colony right away. If it was practically very difficult for a state to assert itself over them, it's very likely that the severity of that state would not last for very long. It's a physical thing. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be based on geography. Since the Industrial Revolution and the explosion of technology, I think that technology this is not a prediction because technology is a two-edged sword for sure, this may change the dynamic. And there may be, the Industrial Revolution has kind of changed everything, and I'm not going to say that I know what all those changes will mean and imply, but it has changed the dynamic, which not necessarily in an entirely positive, but also not in an entirely negative way. But I am increasingly kind of leaning that states is a form of exploitation that just requires certain circumstances. People want to exploit other people in that way. At least some people do. Somebody commented on my other video. I know somebody who never, he doesn't want status. I'm like, okay, that's fine, that's great. But there are plenty of people who do. And if the scenario is, if the circumstances are right, then they're going to go for it. And even if a particular person fails, I'm sure there are plenty of would-be petty tyrants in Neolithic, the Nile Valley, who ended up dead. Who picked on the wrong house or whatever, the wrong neighborhood, the wrong cluster of villages, or met his counterpart and lost and died. As Azar-Got talks about this, if becoming the head of a state is really actually good for your genetic, well-being. And people will say, oh, well, look at Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan had, 1% of the population in the entire world is descended from him right now. Okay, well, yeah, but he's the most successful conqueror ever. Your typical king doesn't quite get that. And a high proportion of heads of state meet violent ends. And historically, this also meant that most of their children, all their known living children, would be wiped out also. Or not necessarily typically, but frequently. So you would have had a lot of people kind of angling for becoming the godfather of the Nile Valley. The fact that most of them failed, however, doesn't mean that one of them isn't eventually going to win. But that's hardly an argument that it was necessary, or that the people in the Nile Valley would be better off, because they have an overlord who's going to exploit them. Absolutely, the exploitation was overt and exceptional, and it's very hard. Just imagine, going and taking, whatever, 5% or 10% of the male population after the harvest, during the flood, when the Nile flood or whatever, and take them all and say, okay, I know that you've worked all year and you haven't had a great diet and you have a short life, because I guess a lot of these people, it's rare to live to 30, apparently. And you're going to spend the next couple months in back-breaking labor. You will be paid in beer and grain, basically. Very, very basic foodstuffs with occasionally small pittances of meat, maybe, if you're lucky. And all this labor is going to manifest into this giant pyramid or a temple or whatever else. What do you think those people would be doing, if they weren't forced to do that? Well, they probably relax, they probably rest some of the time, which isn't necessarily bad. You need to rest, improve the quality of your life a little bit. And if they did do labor, they would probably do labor that they perceive to be in their own interests. maybe they make their canal a little bit better. Maybe they make their house a little bit better. Maybe they grow, maybe they set aside a little garden, or or uh, intensively cultivate their own lands that slightly bit more, and they have a little bit more capital, and they use it. Maybe they have a few nicer things in their house, and or their dwelling, if the house is even the right thing. Maybe they add a mat instead of just living on the floor or whatever. And all that sounds kind of modest, except when you think, okay, but then you multiply that by hundreds of thousands, and then you multiply that by thousands of years. You're talking about the difference between whether there's going to be a middle class or not, or whether there's going to be any capital accumulation. And this is where, although this is hypothetical and maybe it is hyperbolic as well, it starts to wonder if people weren't doing this, but instead they were doing things that they thought bettered their own lives, it's safe to assume that their lives would actually get better. It's very hard to argue that the optimal way for people to spend their free time is to build a pyramid so that the king's dead body can be buried in a very symmetric, very impressive pile of stone. I have a hard time seeing how that is the optimal way that their labor should be expended. And yet that's kind of the argument you would have to make if you were going to say that their coercion to do this was justified. It's for their own good. No, they probably would do better on their own, or organizing to that end, rather than being organized and being drafted into the slave army to aggrandize Pharaoh's ego, or the king's ego. I'm talking about Egypt, but I'll be talking about any monarchy generally. And I will be doing a monarchy video probably pretty soon here. And it's easy to let one's imagination run wild and be like, well, what if that, what if they're, and it's counterfactual, so like, this is, take it for what it is. But like, we're talking about a difference, a substantial difference every year in terms of the life of the well-being of people. And then also, like, this translates into technological advances and how quick they are and how slow they are. I mean, when everything's subordinated to the state, it's all retarded, like what developments happen. And, we're talking about going back 5,000 years. Like, what would be the difference at this endpoint? It's very hard to predict, but it's hard to see how it would be more geared towards alleviating the wants and desires of people, and not the cult of personality of a tiny political elite, which has squandered all those resources. Like, all that is now is a big pile of rocks. It's impressive to look at. Like, maybe there's some tourism associated with that. It's not a very good return on investment. It's a terrible return on investment. There was no capital accumulation. There was, regal authoritarian accumulation, which served the interest of the monarch and no one else. Oh, well, and, his sycophants, his courtiers, it served them as well, although just not as much. So, anyway, it's a good book if you're interested in learning about the history of ancient Egypt. It's an overview, obviously. I feel like, the New Kingdom could probably have its own book, and the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom, and all that. But it's a good overview, a very easy, good page turner. So, yeah, I think the origin of the states it definitely correlates with just the areas that are more susceptible to it, and not with circumstances where it's hypothetically more theoretically necessary, if that makes any sense. We don't, and again, the ideology, the rhetoric of the rulers does not reflect the kind of the Benthamite or the social contract. None of that. It reflects a exploitative narrative, overtly in the ancient past. Shockingly. I mean, I was shocked reading this book how explicit it was. I always thought the Assyrians kind of took the cake there, because the Assyrians, when they talk about foreigners, like, oh, we slit their throats, we murdered their children and raped them, blah blah blah. And I go, okay, they're pretty on. They're not very politically correct back then. Pharaohs were the same way. For their own people, like the crook and the flail that Tut holds, Tutmosa, Tutankhamun, he's not holding those to herd sheep. He's holding those to herd people. You know, the pastoralists from the plain came down and said, "You are all subhumans for us to rule and to manage as we see fit, to do whatever we want. Everything is ours. Your lives, your property, your labor, everything is ours to do with as we please." And it's just, of course, that's vile and evil and terrible and awful and contemptible and all that. But it's also understandable, just in the sense that we know that motivation exists and it's out there. But what really kind of irritates me is then the people who want to come and then justify it and be like, "Oh, no, they're not doing this because of their own aggrandizement. They're doing it to help everyone, for the benefit of everybody." Or even if some of the more sophisticated arguments will be like, "Well, yes, their motivation is selfish. That's true, but the result is net positive. They're doing, even though they're doing this for selfish reasons, you know, the magic of this institution of the state is that by doing that, they are actually helping everybody." It's the Hobbesian, you know, the monarch. He wants to plunder us, and so he imposes prosperity and peace. Yeah, bullshit. Fuck that shit. Like, no. No, that has got to be the sorriest excuse. I don't know any con man in the world with a silver enough tongue to sell that shit to somebody. You know. But anyway, I don't know when I'll upload this, but when I do, y'all get to see it.